Subscribe to take your place in this universe full of science fiction and horror stories, and go after the unknown, because some truths are hidden in the dark. The world had fallen into silence, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of absence, the hush of something vast and breathing that had been severed mid-inhale. A hush that had not existed before, not in the centuries of war and ruin humanity had inflicted upon itself. Even in its darkest moments, Earth had never truly been quiet. Cities had always pulsed with life, even in their decay. Engines humming in the distance, the murmur of conversations in alleyways, the rustle of wind through trees that still stood resilient among the concrete. But now there was nothing. No sirens wailing in mourning, no cries of the wounded, no last words spoken into the empty air. Just stillness. The cities lay in ruin, great metal spines of skyscrapers twisted into charred skeletons, streets littered with the wreckage of vehicles whose drivers had never escaped. Glass crunched beneath the weight of settling ash, but there was no wind to carry it away. The sky, once bright and ever-changing, was cloaked in a dense, smothering gray, broken only by the distant, hulking shadows of ships that did not belong. Smoke rose from the wreckage, curling lazily into the poisoned air, but it did not drift. It hung, stagnant, as if even the air itself had given up. No birds scattered at the sound of distant explosions. No insects hummed in the shadows. No voices called out from beneath the rubble. Earth, in all its defiance, had been conquered in 12 hours. Yet something still moved within the wreckage. A figure, silent and precise, wove through the debris, stepping over the scorched remains of a world that no longer belonged to him. His body bore the scars of 100 battles, but none had been like this. There had been no battles here, no drawn-out war, no desperate last stand. Humanity had not been defeated in combat, but in slaughter. He had seen them fall, soldiers torn apart by weapons beyond human understanding, families reduced to smoldering outlines on crumbling walls. The invaders had come not to conquer, but to erase. And they had done so with efficiency. Swift, unrelenting, but they had made a mistake. They had underestimated him. They had learned humanity through its history, its leaders, its conquerors. They had studied fear and weakness, anticipated surrender. But they had not prepared for him, not for something engineered for war, but tempered by loss. Once he had been a man, a soldier, but those words no longer fit. Not after what they had done to him, not after what he had become. Faster, stronger, more durable. A prototype, a relic of a war that had never come, a warrior meant to win battles that had never been fought. And now, the last, unwanted legacy of a species that no longer existed. He crouched in the husk of what had been a military convoy, fingers brushing against a rifle half buried in the ash. The steel was warped, the barrel twisted into useless scrap, the trigger fused from heat. A pointless relic. He let it fall. Humanity's weapons had done nothing against the invaders' towering machines, their armor like obsidian, their weapons that did not fire bullets but beams of sheer unmaking. His own enhancements had made him more resilient, but resilience was not enough. He needed strategy. He needed patience. And above all, he needed to make them bleed. A low hum vibrated through the wreckage. He pressed his back against the skeletal remains of a transport truck, muscles tensing. A patrol. They moved in squads of 3, tall, insectoid figures clad in dark, segmented exoskeletal armor. Their faces, if they could be called such, were featureless aside from the slits of pale blue light where eyes should have been. They spoke in static bursts, a language of clicks and pulses. He had no translator, but he didn't need one to understand their intent. They were hunting for survivors. He had no plans to be found. As they passed, he moved, not with hesitation, but with precision. Every step calculated, every breath controlled. He had studied them in the hours since the fall, learned the gaps in their awareness, the sluggish turn of their heads, the blind spots in their formations. They had conquered a world in half a day, but they did not expect resistance. Not anymore. Not from one man. He struck the last in line first. one hand clamped over its throat, the other twisting sharply at the base of its skull. There was a brutal snap, a spasm of limbs, and then nothing. The body crumpled, and he caught it before it could make a sound. The second turned at the disturbance. Too late. The blade in his hand slid between the plating of its armor, finding the soft tissue beneath. The alien jerked violently, its limbs seizing before it slumped against him, blue blood seeping between his fingers. He let it slide to the ground. The third had already begun to turn, the weapon on its arm humming as it powered up. He lunged. The blast scorched the space where he had stood a moment before, heat licking at the side of his face as he closed the distance. The knife came down, once, twice, punching through armor, through flesh, until the creature collapsed beneath him. He breathed, steady and controlled, then wiped his blade against the nearest corpse before sheathing it. The fight had lasted seconds. He straightened, glancing up at the sky. The enemy's ships still loomed like gods of old, their presence casting long shadows over a dead world. He did not pray to them. He did not curse them. He only watched, calculated. They were not invincible. Nothing was. The patrol would be reported missing soon. He had little time. He knelt, fingers curling around the weapon strapped to the last alien's arm. The design was sleek, foreign, but he had always been quick to adapt. He wrenched it free, turning it over in his hands. The weight was strange, different, but he understood weapons in the way others understood language. He aimed at the nearest wreck, testing the trigger. A pulse of blue energy shot forth, incinerating the rusted metal in an instant. His lips curled, baring his teeth. They had their gods, but he would teach them fear. The city did not sleep, though it no longer lived. It remained in a state between ruin and resistance, a vast and broken graveyard where the dead had left no bodies, only the remnants of their absence. The wind moved sluggishly through the skeletal remains of buildings, carrying the acrid scent of burnt metal and scorched earth, but it brought no relief from the stillness. The fires that flickered in the distance were dying, but the war was not over. Not for him. The girl followed, her small footsteps barely making a sound as she stepped over the ruins of the world she had once known. She had not spoken since they left the storefront, but she hadn't lagged behind either. She moved with a quiet awareness, her pace measured, deliberate. She was used to hiding, to avoiding notice. That much was clear. He kept his stride steady, adjusting his movements to ensure she could keep up without needing to struggle. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't planned for anything beyond the next few hours. Survive, kill the enemy, make them pay for what they had done. It had been a simple path, one that required nothing more than patience and violence. But now something had shifted. He wasn't alone. He told himself it didn't change anything. The hum of enemy patrols echoed in the distance, distant but deliberate. They were searching now, not just for survivors. No, that stage was over. They were looking for him. The missing squad, the destroyed drone, the stolen weapon. They had noticed. He had assumed they would send another standard patrol, unaware of what had taken their soldiers. But as he paused at the edge of a collapsed overpass, scanning the city below, he saw that he had underestimated them. The ships had moved. They were adjusting their formations, shifting their paths, creating a perimeter. They weren't just searching. They were boxing him in. His jaw clenched. Good. That meant they were afraid. The girl tugged lightly at his sleeve. He turned, and she gestured toward a side street, partially blocked by the remains of a toppled communications tower. It had once been a towering construct of steel and glass, but now it lay in jagged pieces, its wires spilling into the road like severed veins. She didn't speak, just pointed. He studied the path, analyzing the angles, the sight lines. It was a better route than the one he had planned. More cover, fewer open spaces. Had she been watching the patrols as well, tracking their movements, just as he had? He gave a short nod and moved forward. She followed. They slipped through the wreckage, avoiding the pale sweep of searchlights that carved through the ruins like slow-moving blades. His senses remained sharp, every step measured, every sound cataloged. The girl was just as careful, her breathing controlled, her steps light. She had done this before. They reached the hollow remains of a high-rise, its lower floors collapsed, its upper levels shattered. A perfect hiding place. He led her inside, moving through the debris until they reached what had once been a stairwell. It was barely intact, but enough of it remained for them to climb. They ascended in silence, the city unfolding below them as they reached the fourth floor. From here, he could see the enemy's response more clearly. They weren't just patrolling. They were searching for patterns, studying the ruins, adjusting their movements based on where he had been, where he might go next. They were learning. That meant he had limited time before they adapted completely. The girl crouched near a broken window, watching the streets below. The blue glow of the enemy's searchlights reflected in her wide eyes, but she remained still, focused, not afraid. He studied her for a moment. She was young, but there was no panic in her expression, no hesitation in the way she moved. She should have been shaking, crying, clinging to some fragile hope that help was coming. But she wasn't. She had already accepted that there was no help. She was like him. "How long have you been out here?" His voice was quiet but firm. She hesitated, then raised 3 fingers. 3 days? 3 weeks? He studied her again, this time looking past the dirt-streaked face, past the tangle of unkempt hair. Her clothes were worn, but not in tatters. A school uniform, at least it had been once. The fabric, though dirty, had not been completely shredded by exposure. Her hands, though thin, did not shake from starvation. She had been eating. She had found shelter, supplies. She had survived, and not just by running. "You've been hiding." It wasn't a question. She nodded. "Alone." A pause, then a slow shake of the head. Not alone. Not at first. His jaw tightened. He had seen the aftermath of the invasion, the mass eradications, the way entire buildings had been turned to dust, their occupants erased. There had been no organized resistance. The military had fallen before it could mount a defense. Civilians had been slaughtered before they could flee. Whoever she had been with, they weren't here anymore. A distant tremor shook the ground, faint but deliberate. The girl tensed, her fingers curling into the fabric of her sleeve. He turned toward the window, watching as the ships adjusted again. They were shifting their search patterns, expanding outward. He exhaled, slow and measured. He had 2 choices: stay here and wait for them to pass, or keep moving before they closed in completely. The logical choice was to leave her here. She had survived this long. She could keep surviving. But he was done leaving things behind. He turned back to her. "We need to move." She nodded once. No questions. No hesitation. He led the way. The city breathed in whispers, a hollow exhale through crumbling structures and twisted steel. The air carried the scent of dust, scorched metal, and something older, something rotting beneath the weight of its own stillness. The night wrapped around the ruins like a predator waiting for its prey to falter. He and the girl moved without speaking, their footsteps swallowed by the broken world around them. They had been running for hours, weaving through the dead husk of civilization, slipping between collapsed highways and shattered alleyways. The sky, once a beacon of stars and possibilities, now belonged to the enemy. Their ships hovered like silent sentinels, their searchlights sweeping in slow, patient arcs. They were closing in. He had seen it in the way the patrols shifted, how their movements tightened, cutting off routes before he reached them. They weren't searching blindly anymore. They were predicting, calculating. They knew someone was out here. A cold weight settled in his gut. Not fear, not yet. It was the recognition of something inevitable. If he stayed on the surface, they would find him. He glanced at the girl. She had kept up, her breath steady despite the relentless pace. She was small, quick, slipping through the wreckage as if she had been born in it. And maybe she had. He still knew nothing about her. Not really. She had answered his questions with silence, her past buried in a grave of unspoken words. She didn't look at him now. Her gaze remained ahead, scanning the ruins with quiet intensity. She knew something was wrong. Maybe she had known long before he had. He stopped, raising a hand in a silent signal. She halted beside him, waiting. They were near the city's industrial sector now, where the remains of factories and warehouses stretched like skeletal husks against the horizon. a labyrinth of rusted beams and shattered concrete. Somewhere beneath it, the tunnels waited. If they could find an entrance, they could disappear. He listened. The wind carried distant sounds, metal scraping, the low whir of something mechanical. Then, closer, the rhythmic pulse of an approaching patrol. Not just foot soldiers. Something heavier. His grip tightened around the alien weapon strapped to his back. He motioned toward a collapsed building, its exposed framework creating a tangle of steel and shadow. The girl understood immediately. Without hesitation, she slipped into the darkness, pressing herself against the cold metal. He followed, crouching low. A shadow passed overhead. Not a drone. He risked a glance upward. It was unlike anything he had seen before. A sleek, black construct hovered above the ruins, its shape shifting as it adjusted to the terrain. It was scanning, but not in the way the others had. This wasn't searching for signs of heat or movement. This was something else. Something new. A tracker. He exhaled slowly. They weren't just looking for him. They were hunting him. And they had evolved. The girl gripped his sleeve, just a slight touch, but enough. She had noticed it too. He turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze. Her face remained unreadable, but her fingers tightened. She was telling him something. She had seen this before. The realization settled deep in his mind, a sharp twist of understanding. She hadn't just been hiding. She had been running from them. The tracker's searchlight passed inches from their cover, scanning the wreckage with meticulous precision. He held still, feeling the vibrations of its engine through the steel beneath them. The girl didn't move, didn't breathe. She had learned this part well. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the machine drifted forward, continuing its hunt. He waited until the hum of its engine faded before rising. They had to move now. He led her deeper into the ruins, keeping close to the broken walls, the jagged remains of the city offering what little cover it could. The tunnels weren't far now. He could see the remnants of an old loading dock up ahead, the concrete split open for whatever force had torn through it during the invasion. If there was an access point, it would be there. But the girl stopped. Her head tilted slightly, listening. Her fingers curled into a fist at her side. A signal. He heard it a second later. Not the enemy. Something else. It was faint, barely audible beneath the distant hum of patrols, but it was there. A sound that didn't belong in this dead world. A voice. Muffled. Human. His mind sharpened. There shouldn't have been anyone left. He had accepted that long ago. The calculations were too clear, the statistics too final. Humanity had not lost a war. It had been erased. And yet, he looked at the girl. She was already moving toward the sound. He hesitated. Logic told him to ignore it. Keep moving. Find the tunnels. Survive. But something deeper, something buried beneath the years of conditioning, pushed him forward. They moved quickly, weaving through the wreckage until the source of the sound became clear. A small structure, half collapsed, barely standing against the weight of the ruins pressing in around it. He scanned the perimeter. No enemy presence. No patrols. But there was movement inside. The girl stayed back as he approached. His steps were silent, his breath steady. He reached the doorway, placing a hand against the splintered frame. The voice had stopped. Whoever was inside had heard him. He stepped forward. The figure that emerged from the shadows was not what he expected. A man, older, ragged, his face lined with exhaustion and something else. Recognition. Not of him, of what he was. You're one of them, the man rasped. Not an accusation. A fact. The girl remained silent behind him, watching. He didn't answer. The man exhaled, glancing toward the girl, then back to him. I thought we were all gone, the man said. But then you started killing them, and they started searching. They're scared of you. His mind processed the words quickly, analyzing the implications. If this man had survived, he had been hidden well, so well that even the enemy had missed him. But now, because of what he had done, the enemy was looking closer. The girl shifted slightly, her eyes flicking toward the ruined sky. She knew what he was thinking. They weren't safe here. Not anymore. The man studied him. You have a plan? The question hung in the air. He had planned for survival. He had planned to fight, to make the enemy bleed. But now, he looked at the girl, then back at the man. Yeah, he said. I do now. The tunnel swallowed them in silence. The air was dense, thick with the scent of rusted metal, damp stone, and something older, something stale, as if the space itself had been holding its breath for years. The darkness pressed close, curling around them like a living thing, and the sound of their footsteps, though careful, echoed too loudly. He took the lead, weapon raised, every sense attuned to the space around them. The girl followed close, her steps light, controlled. The older man moved with experience, not with the disciplined grace of a soldier, but with the caution of someone who had learned survival the hard way. He knew these tunnels, but he hadn't been here in a long time. The walls stretched in either direction, a ribcage of old infrastructure, pipes lining the corridor like exposed veins. Faint markings, smeared with time, traced some of the surface's old warnings, directions, remnants of those who had once tried to find safety down here. But there was no movement, no sound, no sign that life remained. And that was wrong. He had expected something. Scavengers, survivors, even the quiet hum of forgotten machinery. But this place was dead in a way that went beyond abandonment. The girl slowed beside him, her breathing shallow. She had been silent before, but now there was something different about it. She was listening, and he heard it too. A sound just beneath the surface of the quiet. Faint, wet, not footsteps, not machinery. A dragging, skittering noise just out of reach. The old man exhaled. They send their failures down here, he murmured. His grip on the weapon tightened. Failures. They don't kill their mistakes, the man said. They let them fester. The girl shifted, her fingers pressing into the fabric of her sleeve. He noticed it now, the tension in her shoulders, the way her body had coiled, not in preparation to fight, but to run. She knew. The realization came too late. A sharp click cut through the air, followed by another. Then another. A chain reaction, rippling outward into the tunnels like a signal. And then the dark moved. It came from the edges, from the places where the shadows were thickest, limbs unfolding from the walls, from the ceiling. The sound of scraping metal on concrete, of breath that was too wet, too hollow. Not the enemy's soldiers. Something else. The first one lunged, and he fired. The alien weapon discharged with a sharp pulse of light, illuminating the thing just long enough to see it clearly. It had once been one of them, but its form was wrong. Its exoskeleton was cracked and uneven, flesh exposed where there should have been armor. Its limbs, too many, too long, twitched as if unsure of their purpose. Its face was ruined, the pale blue glow of its former kind now reduced to flickering embers and sunken sockets. And its mouth had teeth. Rows of them, jagged and irregular, as if something had forced them into a shape they were never meant to take. The shot tore through its chest, and it screamed. Not a mechanical sound, not the cold, calculated clicks of the enemy soldiers. This was something else, something that should never have had a voice. And then the others moved. He turned sharply, firing again as another figure emerged from the ceiling, its body twisting unnaturally as it dropped toward them. The old man swore under his breath, yanking a rusted pipe from the ground, and swung. The blow sent the thing staggering, but did not fall. They're not dead enough, the man snarled. The girl hadn't moved, not out of fear. She was watching. Not the creatures, but him. He didn't have time to think about why. Another shot, another shriek. The tunnels came alive with sound now, the echoes stretching outward like ripples in water. And beneath it all, something else, a deeper noise, one that vibrated through the floor, through his bones. A warning. This wasn't a real threat. This was just the beginning. We have to move, the man snapped, swinging again, his makeshift weapon crunching into the skull of one of the creatures. Tunnel splits ahead. Left goes deeper. Right takes us to an old exit. Deeper meant unknown territory. But right meant surface. And they were waiting up there. The creatures shifted, bodies jerking unnaturally, eyes flickering as if struggling to process light. If they hesitated, even for a second, they would be overrun. The girl made the choice for them. She turned left. Without hesitation, without a word. He followed. The tunnels twisted sharply, the air thick with decay. The sound of pursuit followed them, but the creatures did not move as fast as they did. They lurched, uncoordinated, broken things that should not have been alive. But they weren't slowing down. They don't stop, the man panted beside him. They don't stop. No, they wouldn't. Because they weren't hunting. They were escaping. He realized it as the tunnel widened, opening into a space that had once been a station. Tracks stretched out beneath layers of debris, broken trains half swallowed by darkness. Signs still hung from the ceiling, their words faded but legible. The girl stopped so suddenly that he nearly collided with her. She was staring at something. A wall. At first, it seemed unremarkable. A collapsed barrier, stone and metal caved inward from some long-forgotten impact. But the way she looked at it, her fingers curled tight at her sides, her breath shallow, told him otherwise. It wasn't just debris. It was sealed, not by time, by design, and something had tried to break out. The claw marks stretched across the surface, deep grooves carved into the metal, overlapping in chaotic patterns. The stone was scorched in places, as if something had burned against it, fighting to be free. The man exhaled sharply. This isn't just a tunnel. No, it was a prison. The girl took a step back. The creatures were coming, their clicking voices growing louder, more frantic. And from behind the sealed wall, a noise, not like theirs, deeper, older, awake. The girl turned to him. For the first time since he had met her, there was fear in her eyes. "We can't be here," she whispered. But it was too late. Something cracked. The wall moved. The wall split open like flesh tearing, not stone breaking. A sound rippled through the chamber, something deeper than hearing, something felt in the bones, a vibration of existence itself shifting. The air thickened with heat, the damp scent of decay mixing with something sharper, something ancient. The creature stepped forward, uncoiling from the darkness, sleek and impossibly fluid, as though it had been sculpted from living obsidian. It was unlike the enemy, unlike anything he had seen before. And yet, something in its movement felt familiar. The creatures that had chased them, the broken, mindless things lurking in the tunnels, shrank away, pressing themselves into the shadows, limbs trembling in something that was not fear, but submission. Their clicking sounds softened into rhythmic pulses, not panicked, but reverent. They were not running from this thing. They were welcoming it. The girl stood still, unafraid. The old man had no such stillness. He shifted his weight, grip tightening around his rusted weapon. "We leave. Now." His voice was quiet, but edged with something hard. The girl didn't move. The creature watched her. Then it spoke. Not with words. Not even with sound in the way humans understood it. It was a pulse, a vibration in the air, something that bypassed language and reached into the core of the body itself. And the girl understood. She exhaled, slow and steady, and answered, not in words, but in kind. A soft click, almost too quiet to hear. The old man stiffened. No, his voice was sharper now. "Whatever this is, it's not." The creature's gaze snapped to him, and it knew him. It stepped forward with deliberate ease, its motions smooth, controlled. Its presence filled the space, not with aggression, but with weight. The girl raised a hand, not in fear, but in warning. Not to the creature, to them. "He's not the enemy," she said. Her voice was small, but it carried. The man's breath hitched, but he did not lower his weapon. "Then what is it?" She turned her gaze to the walls, to the claw marks carved into the stone, to the creatures still pressed into the dark. "They didn't come to destroy us," she said. The words twisted something in his gut. His pulse drummed against his ribs. "Then what did they come for?" The girl's gaze didn't waver. "They came to stop something worse." The chamber fell silent. The weight of that truth settled into the ruined air. The creature did not confirm it, did not deny it. It simply turned, stepping forward, past them, past the trembling things that had once hunted them, moving with purpose, with certainty. It had not escaped. It had been released, and it knew exactly where it was going. The girl followed. He hesitated. Everything he had known, everything he had believed, was shifting beneath him. The war, the destruction, the enemy they had fought to survive. It had never been about conquest. It had been about containment. The enemy had not come as invaders. They had come as wardens. And now the prison was open. The old man inhaled sharply, glancing at him. Tell me you're not. But he was. Because there was only one thing left to do. He followed. The tunnel stretched ahead, the walls damp with condensation, lined with old cables and forgotten systems. The creature moved without hesitation, its long limbs nearly soundless against the stone. The girl kept close behind it, her small frame barely a shadow in the dim light. He caught up to her. How do you know? She didn't look at him. Because they left me behind. Something cold slithered down his spine. She had been alone for too long, had survived too well. She wasn't just a lost child. She was part of the story that had been buried beneath war, beneath ruin. And she had been waiting for this moment. The tunnel sloped upward, and ahead, light bled in from the broken world above. The creature did not slow. It did not hesitate. Then it lifted its head, gazing past the ruins, toward the sky, toward the ships. It was not looking at them as enemies. It was looking at them as prey. The war was not over. It had never even begun.